Okay, so we decided to start with a workshop series, and today I'm so happy to actually start our afternoon program with Professor Laura Tosi, who's going to talk about academic self-fashioning, wearing different hats in children's literature. Right, let me take some time to introduce Professor Tosi for those who might not know her, and I guess there's just nobody who doesn't. Laura Tosi is, of course, full professor at the University of Venice Foscari, where she teaches. She's been teaching language, literature, and culture there. Her research interests in the areas of specialization follow two main lines of development. One is the Elizabethan, Jacobean, and Karen literature, with publications ranging from Ben Jonson's Strategy of Violence to John Webster. But then she has a second area, which is children's literature. She has taught courses, and she's very active in research on British children's literature, in particular in the area of rewriting practices and adaptation, and also on the history of the literary fairy tale. She's been organizing a number of international conferences on this issue, one being, for instance, Hearts of Lightness, the Magic of Children's Literature. Has edited a very interesting collection of Victorian fairy tales with Marsilio, Draghi e Principesse, fiabe impertinenti dell'Ottocento inglese, and also she published a volume of La fiaba letteraria inglese, Metamorfosi di un genere. She also has a book edited together with Professor Petrina from this university, entitled Dalla BC a Harry Potter, storia della letteratura inglese per l'infanzia e la gioventù. In the area, instead of early modern studies, she has again edited with Professor Petrina a collection of essays on Elizabeth I, representations of Elizabeth in early modern culture, which came out with Palgrave in 2011. She has, and this is a very prestigious honor, she was, of course, awarded. She was invited to deliver the fourth Sibylle Pantazzi lecture on fairy tales and Pinocchio. Her current, it's a long story. I should stop somewhere. She's currently working on a contemporary analysis of children's fantasy traditions, but actually she has already published in 2018, together with Peter Hunt, a monograph study dedicated to the fabulous journeys of Alice and Pinocchio, the parallel worlds of national and transnational classic fantasies. She also published a light-hearted, she calls it, volume entitled As Fit as a Fish, The English and Italians Revealed, written again with a very famous name, that of Peter Hunt. And she has been working very, very dramatically, as you can guess by now. But I would like to remind everybody that the Children's Literature in Italy website has moved to Venice, and she is the coordinator of a very brilliant and important new research on children's literature, not only in Italy, but at a very global level. As I said, she is possibly one day, when the PowerPoint is on, going to talk about self-fashioning, and she devised a very special title, which I'm going to explain in a minute as soon as we have but also the PowerPoint allegedly seems to work. Okay, thank you so much. This is really for PhD students, so it's okay if you cancel. Yeah, fine. Yeah. Okay. There they are. Okay, so I'd like to explain this odd title, okay, for those who aren't experts in early modern drama. In early modern studies, the term self-fashioning, this is not moving. I know. Okay, thank you. Okay. The term self-fashioning recalls Stephen Greenblatt's concept of self-fashioning in his influential Renaissance self-fashioning. This concept refers to how individuals in the Renaissance consciously shaped, or rather crafted, their public personas and identities in response to social, political, and cultural forces. This self-fashioning isn't so much an expression of an internal self
instead is a deliberate construction influenced by literature, art, and social expectations. I'll come back to this in a moment. So the second part of my title, the idea of wearing different hats, is something academics are familiar with, especially when working across different critical approaches or historical periods. The third part of my title, children's literature, is an area I approached later in my career after my initial early modern focus, and one I believe has made me a better scholar of Shakespeare also. So today I'd like to throw out some ideas across these three areas. So yes, there will be a bit of autobiographical stuff, but not too much, to help us think about what it means to have a self-awareness as a scholar. I don't have answers and I don't deliver messages, but just a few thoughts to invite reflection. Then I'll talk about what it means to study children's literature from a literary perspective. Perhaps some of you might be interested in pursuing work in this direction someday. But back to self-fashioning. I'd like to ask you a question. How do you define yourself as a scholar? Do you define yourself as a scholar of a specific area or period? There's always that moment at a conference when someone, often a more senior person, asks you about this. Tell me more about yourself. Where do you work? What are you working on? How do you answer? And do you answer differently if this is asked in Italy versus abroad, in England or the US, if you've already started lecturing abroad? Do you say, I work on, mi occupo di? Or do you say, I am a medievalist, I am a postcolonial student, I am a linguist? So do you say what you are academically, or do you emphasize what you do? Is this a single identity, or do you have a double one? Do you say, I'm a medievalist, but here at this conference, I'm presenting a paper of T.S. Eliot? Are you a one identity plus, or is it one identity full stop? Academic identities will change, whether we like it or not. For me, it's interesting to see how I've always been drawn to issues of transformation, metamorphosis, how texts and genres evolve over time, and how interests in intertextuality, adaptation, and transmediation have remained constants in my work. But for years, I fashioned myself as an early modern person who occasionally dabbled in other areas. During my PhD in Pisa and Florence, focused more on individual research than on classes or seminars. We had to produce a publishable article in every year for first and second years without any seminar support. So individual research and then having to produce something. While my colleagues focused on areas close to their final thesis topics, I decided to work on Alexander Pope in my first year, reasoning that it was now or never, since I'd likely never study 18th century poetry again. I didn't even like it, but yet surprisingly, that work became a published article. In my second year, I worked on the contemporary novelist Iris Murdoch and her postmodern writing of Shakespeare. So was it useful to dabble between different areas? Absolutely. I believe in cross-fertilization across fields, especially if you're someone who finds it frustrating to work within just a small area for an extended time. But mentors will differ on this. Some say you should master one area before branching out, while others believe it's useful to move across academic directions and circles. I find that people who work on Shakespeare and those who work on children's literature are often very different personalities, different approaches to their fields, and even different attitudes towards them. And I've always found this contrast a bit baffling. So let's go back to the idea of wearing different hats. This is when I asked ChatGPT to give me an image of a scholar of English literature. They came out with a male one. So then I scolded ChatGPT as I normally do, and then they will provide a female. I never look like, any of these actually, never. But anyway, so this is the idea that they have. No, but not really. Okay. So wearing different hats. Mental coaches are always asking, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? But I'd like to reframe that. Do you think you'll still be happy working on what you're working on now in 5 years' time? Do you see yourself working on Caroline drama, Rachele, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? Carolina, young adult dystopias for the next 10 years' time. I know most of you probably want to imagine yourself securing a university position in 5 or 10 years, but that's a topic for a different talk. So, second question. Do you think that what you're working on now will produce something original, innovative, or useful for other scholars in the near future? Are there offshoots of your research that might be interesting or that you could graft onto another area? We may not have answers to these questions yet, but I think asking them is worthwhile, and a bit of self-reflection can be useful. This is more about self-awareness than self-fashioning, and later on, self-promotion. I'd say I've mainly 2 hats, early modern scholar and children's literature scholar. But even now, I still struggle with broader definitions. Am I mainly a literary critic or a literary historian? If I look at the keynote addresses I've given over the years, most were comparative. From my first keynote in Romania on early modern drama and Italian literature, to my latest one in the US a couple of months ago on Pinocchio translation and English children's literature. So in a way, it's other academics who help us to shape our academic personas. So when I attend children's literature conferences, take this last one on Pinocchio, no one cared that I also work on early modern topics, except that I managed to find connections between Hamlet and Pinocchio. So maybe someone guessed I was also a Shakespearean, or maybe they just thought I was a bit mad. This is just to show that self-fashioning and academic self-awareness are things that you'll probably think about throughout your career. So now we come to the part where I talk about how studying children's literature has made me a better person and maybe a better scholar, but that's not for me to say. Children's literature is an important field. Children's books are also big business. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows still holds the record for fastest sales of any book, with 11 million copies on its first day. And it's been translated into over 70 languages. The Swedish Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, awarded to writers and institutions worldwide, is one of the world's richest literary awards, so the equivalent of 500,000 euros. Books influence readers in all sorts of ways, and children's books are no exception. They don't stand apart from ideology, politics, or history. They are an umbilical cord connecting adult culture to children, and they can change lives and cultures, because despite appearances, they cannot be simple. More on this later. But I think that if we're all here thinking about books today, it's partly because we read children's books when we were young or younger. British children's books have introduced me to a whole new literature, as if I'd started studying Spanish or American literature from scratch. Like any literature, it has an origin. For British children's literature, that's 1744, a development, and it spans all genres. Take the example of epic, for example. So how does a literary scholar contribute to studying children's books? Are we book people or child people? Peter Hunt, the godfather of children's literature studies in Britain, draws this useful distinction. I would say that we are emphatically not child people. Real children in flesh and blood are far less interesting to us than implied child readers. In our capacity as literary critics, we are not parents, teachers, or psychologists. We are not in education or scienze della formazione. We are only slightly interested in what happens when specific books meet specific children, just as we're not really interested in the reaction of cranky old men reading King Lear. We are book people, more interested in what the book itself conveys than in the actual child who'll read it one day, and definitely not in how the book helps with literacy. If discussing an adult book as in a literature seminar, for example, we require certain analytical skills, like the context, its place in cultural history, critical theory, and selecting a critical approach, then discussing a children's book requires exactly the same. Children's literature is indebted to the rise of critical theory that took place in the 1960s, and 70s and beyond, when the canon was expanded and academia made space for feminist theory, post-colonial writing, popular culture, and children's literature. Consequently, children's books have been studied for quite some time at universities across the world, and not only in departments of education. There were, at a conservative estimate of about 10 years ago, more than 3,000 university courses in children's literature in the English-speaking world, many leading to graduate work. There are a lot of conferences, learned and professional journals, international research societies like these two, and books about children's books, and books about children's books. So from psychoanalytic and structuralist approaches to stylistic, gender, disability studies, eco-criticism, cognitive narratology, post-colonial studies, I sound just like Polonius in Hamlet, body studies, food studies, animal studies, post-humanism, you name it, you still need to know a bit about all these areas, or at least one or two, to approach a children's text properly. Over the past 5 years in Venice, I have supervised 2 Marie Curie fellowships that connect children's literature with to the medical humanities, which reflects an interest in sponsoring this kind of work. One on nutrition discourses in children's narratives in England, and a global fellowship in partnership with Brown University called Madness in Fairyland, Reimagining Deviance in the Age of Psychiatry, 1820-1900, which examines the relationship between psychiatric literature and fairy tales in the 19th century. And Alessandro Fabiati, who's just finished this Marie Curie, he's here today with us. So deciding what is or isn't for children is a complex circular process. The adult critic has to identify the concept of childhood being addressed in a work, while also considering the current notions of childhood that actual children bring to the text. You can make some generalizations about how a culture or a society constructs the child, but this concept varies endlessly from home to home and from day to day. Some generalizations are necessary when discussing children's books, or the language becomes impossible, but we can't ignore that the concept of the child is a constant, fluid problem in children's literature criticism. Critics have tried desperately to define children's literature, to find that quality that will help identify a text as a work of children's literature, isolating what makes children's literature distinct. But every time they come up with a definition based on formal qualities, themes, intention, readership, they fail, as you can always find a counterexample, an exception to the rule. So this is one of the latest books on children's literature, and it argues children's literature scholars must proceed with, even in the absence of a definitional consensus. As childhood changes, books remain fixed. So you could say that there are 2 kinds of children's books, books that are for children now, and books that were for children, but no longer feel relevant due to changes in style, language, or purpose. Both types are fascinating to literary or cultural scholars, though each demands different critical tools and reading approaches. It's also important to remember that children's texts aren't simpler to study than other texts. They're actually more complex. As we were saying, the boundaries between children's books and adult books are increasingly blurred. Just look at how many children's books are enjoyed by adults. Think of the Harry Potter series, which was issued with a more adult cover after the initial success. Or, for example, the average reader of young adult dystopian novels, and we're talking thousands of novels here, is reportedly 26, so not really a child. And this is only one example, but most children's books are built on paradoxes like these. For a long time, for example, it was thought that subjects not directly relevant to children, like war, sexuality, violence, shouldn't appear in their books, but they do increasingly, and they've always done. Every era has its own peculiar way of protecting children. Cautionary tales, popular in the 18th and 19th centuries to shield the kids from danger, are much rarer now. You're unlikely to find Bluebeard, a fairy tale about a serial killer, on the shelves of your local bookstore. And yet, as a recent survey shows, 43% of children aged 6 to 10 in southern Italy, for example, use smartphones with daily internet access. So they can access everything. So we assume that children's literature is strong on educational messages, but in reality, books like Alice in Wonderland or even Roald Dahl's works don't teach anything specific to the child reader. Alice, for example, learns nothing from the adult characters or anthropomorphic animals she encounters. And if we think children's books are short, sweet, and simple, just look at Harry Potter or Philip Pullman's novels. As Pullman famously put it, and I've got his words pinned on my door in my office in Venice, there are some themes, some subjects too large for adult fiction. They can only be dealt with adequately in a children's book. Fantasy books, for example, immerse us in epic struggles. Far be from me to make comparisons, but if you want to read about the forces of good versus evil, you're not turning to Jane Austen. You're looking at Tolkien, Milton, Spencer, Lewis, Rowling, and so on. Children's literature also serves as a model for academic disciplines today because it's multicultural, multinational, and interdisciplinary. Studying fairy tales, for example, a long time obsession of mine, you find that the fairy tale canon is inherently transnational. You can't just study English fairy tales without knowing the early French or German fairy tales. This is not always so crucial in adult literature. You don't need to read Saxo Grammaticus to study Hamlet. So adult preference is everywhere in children's literature. Major Anglo-Saxon postmodernist writers like Angela Carter, Robert Hoover, and Donald Barthelme all wrote fairy tales. And not just any fairy tales. As McHale, a leading critic of postmodernism, suggests, Alice in Wonderland is a foundational element of postmodern fiction. So ubiquitous are allusions to Alice in postmodern novels that the presence of Alice might almost be considered a marker of literary postmodernism. If Alice appears, the novel is likely to be postmodernist. Indeed, so ubiquitous are Alice allusions that one might legitimately wonder whether there are any novels that we generally regard as postmodern that do not allude somehow or other to Alice. Postmodern Alice is postmodernism in a nutshell. So if you are into adaptation, remediation, or rewriting practices, children's literature is an absolute treasure trove. Adaptation is how children's literature keeps crossing over into the world of adult literature. When I started working on narrative adaptations of Shakespeare for children, I felt like I could finally put my two hats, Shakespeare scholar and children's lit scholar, together in a way that actually made a useful research contribution. Most people who write about adapting Shakespeare for children tend to come from either Shakespeare studies or children's literature, rarely both. And Alessandra Petrilli is another example of a medievalist who brings a unique perspective to the Harry Potter studies that few Potter scholars can match. So studying these adaptations has made me more attuned, not just to Shakespeare's original text, but to questions of power, choice, and the idea that classics should be made relevant for all kinds of readers, even children. But I have to mention something that does not happen when you study books for adults. It is a subject that provokes strong feelings. Readers are often strongly emotionally and intellectually attached to children's books. They own them. The result is that enthusiasts and experts on children's books exist everywhere. Not only in universities, everyone has an opinion, and they're not inclined to bow to the opinions of experts. The normal power structures of the literary world are reversed. You can present a super detailed analysis of a children's book at a conference, only to have someone in the audience, who may be joined for fun, to tell you the real way to read Alice, because it's what their grandmother taught them. You'd almost never have someone come up and tell you their personal interpretation of Hamlet, except perhaps during an exam. Maybe. However much we might think of children's books, that children's books must be simple and innocent, a moment's thought will show that whatever childhood is, it is neither simple nor innocent. almost all children's books are written by adults, and those adults have conscious or unconscious ideas about what they want childhood to do and what they want the books to do. The books are published by adult publishers. The books are bought by adults. The adult presence is very powerful. It makes us think about dynamics of power. The adult that wants to control what the child reader thinks. It is not simply that, as some critics have written, notably Jacqueline Rose, that the act of writing for children is impossible, or it is inevitably a violation of childhood. It could equally be the case that the actual reader is impervious to, or misinterprets, or willfully ignores the intended manipulation. In children's books, all the rules of transmission and response can be suddenly called into question. So let me give you an example of a very manipulative, intrusive, puzzling incipit of a book. This is the opening of Peter and Wendy, 1911. All children, except one, grow up. They soon know that they will grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject. But henceforth, Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. 2 is the beginning of the end. So you could spend an hour, I think, on this page. Now, there's a superimposed adult perspective here, an explicit nostalgia, and a desire to freeze childhood, which can mean nothing to a child reader. For me, this opening captures the narrator's wish to trap the child in an almost aesthetically enjoyable position that's powerless but pleasing to adults. This is a book that doesn't allow Peter Pan to grow up, to grow old, but freezes him in a perpetual cycle of youth, while all his friends, including Wendy, grow up and will die around him. Welcome to the carefree world of children's literature. I'd like to finish by saying a few words about a very popular genre, that of the picture book, which has until recently been unique to children's books. A more groundbreaking experimental form of text would be difficult to find, polyphonic and multi-referential. The illustrated book is a typical children's genre that has been remediated and appropriated by adults. Think of mangas, graphic novels, and so on. But there is a difference between illustrated books and picture books. So the definition of picture books is a picture book is a complex system with 2 components, images and a written text that are usually in a very close and interdependent relationship, requiring some kind of synthesis from the reader. In contrast, an illustrated book does not rely on images and can be understood even without them. Research on picture books in the Anglo-Saxon field is continuously expanding. These are just some of the books that are available. It's just the tip of the picture book iceberg. There are also recent developments that apply cognitive psychology to picture books, including neuroimages and MRI scans to see how the brain decodes images. And studies on children's literature have greatly emphasized reception theory, the implied reader concept, and all its variations. So I think it is legitimate to think of to hypothesize the term implied viewer for an ideal reader of picture books, someone who is competent at reading images. In the implied reader, Iser argued that literary texts are constructed in such a way as to leave gaps that are filled by the reader's interpretation, thus completing the text. All of this can easily be applied to picture books, systems that leave the ideal reader of images with the freedom to understand the text, to take away what they need. Picture books can be very complex texts to decode. Some critics argue that picture books are intrinsically ironic systems because there is always a gap between the visual and the verbal element. Now, I wanted to show you a couple of books, a couple of picture books. And I could have chosen books in which The dissonance between images and words creates a sense of cognitive surprise. I could have shown you picture books with very sophisticated and artistic illustrations, there are a lot of them. However, today I decided to show you two books that are not particularly arty or graphically complex. They are picture books that were written for children, marketed for children, even the illustrations are childlike, but I need you to do something for me. Let's pretend for a moment that we're not scholars, but just readers. We're reading these books for fun, for enjoyment, for ourselves. When we are not wearing our literary scholar's hat, we can read a children's book, in this case, a picture book, in two ways. Okay, one, we can read it as our adult selves. We do not ignore the child implied reader or viewer, but we do not identify with it. Or, second option, we try to read as children. That is, we accept the role of the implied reader, and in doing so, to some extent, react as our child selves might have done. So we try to reconnect to that part, the part of us that remembers, however, residually, what it was like to read a book like this. And then you will let me know later what identity you chose, the adult self, or whether you were able to pretend to imagine that you were reading as your child self. So here goes the first text. 5 Minutes Peace, Jill Murphy, 2009. It's the back of this book is a part of a series. As you can see, the illustrations are unmistakable for children. The text is also very simple and accessible, but the book also reflects an adult perspective and point of view. The story is about a mother trying to have breakfast alone, take a bath alone, read the newspaper in peace, all the while attempting to escape her 3 children. So this is how it starts. It begins with Mother Elephant looking at her children. The children were having breakfast. This was not a pleasant sight. Okay, so follow. This is, look at her expression, okay? And then, of course, she tries to escape, but the little elephants, her children, are following her. Okay, so she's trying to go away. Okay, peace. She tries to, she manages a cup of coffee during her bath. Heaven, not quite, because, can I sing a little song? The youngest asks her. No, look at her expression. One reads her a story. She's so sinking into the bath. And then in the end, everyone joins her. In the end, they all got in. The little one was in such a hurry that he forgot to take off his pajamas. Okay. She dries off after her bath and walks away with a stern look, finally managing to have breakfast alone. And off she went downstairs, where she had 3 minutes and 45 seconds of peace. They all came to join her. Now, this book probably represents a form of child empowerment. There's an article on the enthusiastic reactions of real children. However, the viewpoint and perspective are adult. And there's a sense of camaraderie too, relating to what it's like to be a parent of young children. Okay, remember your identity here. Then I'll show you the next text. The second text is about a taboo, the death of a child, every parent's nightmare. The author is Michael Rosen, one of the greatest English poets for children, a former children's laureate in the UK, a man with a strong sense of humor, very entertaining, who also works for TV. Well, in 2004, he published Sad Book, following the death of his son Eddie, who died from meningitis at 18. And this deeply autobiographical picture book is illustrated by Quentin Blake, Roald Dahl's preferred illustrator. You might remember some of his illustrations. Blake usually creates satirical drawings and comic sketches using quick sketch-like strokes. Yet in this book, he conveys sadness effectively. The initial absence of color establishes a tone of sorrow and authenticity. Sometimes sad is very big. It's everywhere, all over me. Then I look like this, and there's nothing I can do about it. What makes me most sad is when I think about my son Eddie. He died. I loved him very, very much. but he died anyway. So this is a book which adults can easily empathize, but what about the implied child reader? You see that the color here is reserved for the past, for the memories of when Eddie was alive, when he did things, and then there's a final frame, empty frame to represent Eddie's absence. So in what way does this book talk to a child reader? First of all, it suggests things to cope with sadness. And he doesn't use the word pain, grief, suffering, but only sad, the primary emotion. So he says, sometimes because I'm sad, I do crazy things like shouting in the shower, banging a spoon on the table, or making my cheeks go whoop, woof, woof. Sometimes I'm sad. Because I'm sad, I do bad things. I can't tell you what they are. They are too bad. And it's not fair on the cat. I've been trying to figure out ways of being sad that don't hurt so much. Here are some of them. I tell myself that everyone has sad stuff. I'm not the only one. Maybe you have some too. Every day I try to do one thing I can be proud of. Then when I go to bed, I think very, very, very hard about this one thing. I tell myself that being sad isn't the same as being horrible. I'm sad, not bad. Every day I try to do one thing that means I have a good time. It can be anything so long as it doesn't make anyone unhappy. So in the final pages, it returns to the self-portrait, but this time in color. And he seems to have recovered, but the words say something different. This is me being sad. Maybe you think I'm being happy in this picture. Really, I'm being sad, but pretending I'm being happy. I'm doing that because I think people won't like me if I look sad. And after reading this book, I met Michael a few times, and each time I wonder whether he laughs out of happiness or if he's always sad and just pretending. So, how many of you managed to read these books as your adult selves, or were you able to identify with your child self? Want to share any thoughts on this?
Only adult.
Adult.
Child.
Okay, not child. Adult, not child at all.
To be a child.
Okay.
First one, especially the second one.
Second one impossible, huh?
Yeah.
But this is a children's book, so the implied child leader. So anyway, so I hope this sort of showed you how intensely paradoxical children's books can be, and how paradoxical are our responses to them. And this is another contradiction of children's literature. What I like is that children's books offer endless moments of shared adult-child culture. It is a literature that exists for the needs of younger people, but in the end, it belongs to all readers equally. So I hope you share my belief that all this is intensely interesting to a scholar of literature and culture. Thank you.
It is.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. This is him. Yeah, this is him. Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Mirko Casagranda from the University of Calabria, who's going to talk about onomastics and studies. Okay, Mirko Casagranda is Associate Professor of English Linguistics and Translation Studies at the University of Calabria. His areas of interest include onomastics, critical discourse analysis, post-colonial and translation studies. He has published articles on gender and translation, eco-critical discourse analysis, multiculturalism and multilingualism in Canada, plays and trade names. He has edited the volume Names and Naming in the Post-Colonial English-Speaking World, 2018, and authored the books, but I don't see the books. Oh, sorry, Traduzione e Code Switching come strategie discorsive del linguismo canadese and procedure di naming nel paesaggio linguistico canadese. He served as a member large of the Executive Council of the American Name Society, and he's also on the board of the ISCLI.
Yeah,
Right.
just for a few more weeks, actually.
A few more weeks.
Okay.
Okay, we're
Okay.
happy about that.
Okay, we'll talk about
That's
it.
the AIA.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much, Mirko, for
Thank you.
accepting my invitation and for actually sharing your expertise on onomastics in particular with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marilyn, and thank you the AIA board for inviting me, for I'm very happy to be here, and actually, I think it's the first time in this new building. It's very, very.
Isn't it beautiful?
It's beautiful, yeah. So I would like also to thank the people here in the room and those online. And actually, for me, this is an opportunity to share my research or some of my research in onomastics and discourse studies and their interplay. So how the two actually meet. Onomastics is, of course, it's interdisciplinary by per excellence, I would say. It can be applied to different disciplines and also according to the types and typology of names. But what I'm interested in today, my voice, I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on. I'm very sorry about this.
Trying to speak. You need to go and get some.
No, it's okay. It's just because it was too cold outside. So what I'm interested in today is this interplay between onomastics and critical discourse studies. So the first part of my presentation is going to be a sort of introduction, and then I have some examples, some case studies that I would like to sort of discuss with, I'll do that, discuss with you or with those online. So what I would like to talk about today is how names and naming and the study of proper names contribute to discourse studies and critical discourse analysis in particular. And this interplay is, of course, the aim of discursive onomastics, or what some scholars call onomastic discourse analysis. And I'm thinking about, in particular, Rutkowski and Zvornik, who wrote a few articles about onomastic discourse analysis. That is an onomastic approach to CDA, to critical discourse analysis, and of course also a discursive approach to onomastics. Whereas in the past, the study of names was mostly limited to historical linguistics, especially etymology. So scholars were interested in the etymological element that we find in names. Today, they are more and more seen as part of discourse and analyzed from a discursive perspective and a critical discursive perspective as well. Names used to be considered, especially in the philosophy of language tradition, as singular referring terms. And I'm thinking about Kripke here, who considered names as rigid designators. So that is elements in a language. Actually, some consider names as not belonging to the linguistic system, but as something completely outside of it. This is not, of course, what we do when we see them from a critical discourse analysis point of view. So according to traditional philosophy of language, names are singular referring terms and rigid designators, which means that they denote without connoting. That is, there is no other meaning in them but the one linked to the object, place, person, whatever they refer to. Venus is just Venus, the planet. Mirko is just Mirko, this person here. Padua is just this city. And of course, we already know that in the case of Padua, that could be a little bit more complicated because there are several other Paduas around the world. But from a discursive point of view, instead, names have also other functions and participate in the construction of meaning and discourse. Moreover, they are social and cultural practices. As a matter of fact, giving a name is a performative act that entails power relations within certain ideological structures. So you see the similarities here between naming or naming practices and discourse as we usually define it. So CDA and naming, that is the act of giving a name to something or somebody, are both socially embedded acts. And that's why it is very interesting for onomasticians to focus on the discursive dimension of names. Ideological messages, discourse, as a matter of fact, is codified and embedded not only through lexical, semantic, or syntactic, or textual elements, but also through onymic elements, that is, names. In other words, naming is a form of discourse that analysts should take into account whenever they have names, of course, in the discourse and the text that they analyze. Both CDA and the study of naming practices focus on the social context of language in use, since names are not only linguistic signs, but also social constructs. And as such, they are also ideological and ideologized constructs. And this is particularly true at the metaphorical metonymic level, when names stands for something else and create a network of social meanings that can be considered as a form of onymic discursivity. And there are several examples. I'm pretty sure that all of you can think of examples like that. I'm thinking about social labeling, for example. There are studies about gender and social labels and social labeling as a social linguistic practice. Think about the way then names are used and turned into nouns to refer to someone, to address someone using a name that stands for some other properties, qualities that the person is identified with. An example could be Lolita, for example. So we were talking about literature earlier. Lolita is a fictional character, the novel by Nabokov. And if I say she's a real Lolita, of course, I mean, I have a certain image in mind, and I'm using that for a specific purpose, of course. When it comes to names and critical discourse analysis, we can focus on names in discourse, but also names and naming practices as discourse or as critical discourse analysis. If the focus is on names in critical discourse analysis, that is, how names are used in text that are analyzed from a critical discourse analysis point of view, we can carry out a discursive analysis of proper names, which is close to what we usually do with other language units, like nouns or noun phrases. The focus is on proper names. So we can study the linguistic and grammatical functions of names in texts, for example, reference and nominalization strategies. And here I'm thinking about in particular the Ruth Vodak's approach, which is we know it as the historical discourse approach to discourse. So we can study the linguistic and grammatical functions of names in text, for example, nominalization strategies or predication strategies, the activation or passivization strategies, genericization, collectivization, or individualization strategies, abstractivization or objectification strategies that are usually, related to nouns, but can of course be then applied to proper names. We can also focus on the use of names in the creation of topic or discourse, or the use of names in building an argumentation strategy. I'm actually following all those steps that are usually employed in, as I was saying before, historical discourse approach, and then I'm applying, so to speak, this to names. We can focus on genre structures and stylistic forms, or we can focus also on the historical and geopolitical context of the proper name, where the name is created and used or reappropriated in some cases. Or we can also focus on the hidden ideological assumptions underlying the name. So what is between the lines or beyond the name, so to speak. And examples of this could be the use of derogatory names and nicknames in hate speech. And that can be done, of course, using online materials, online data. Think about social networks, of course. Yeah, the use of derogatory names and nicknames in hate speech, the use of titles to differentiate between male and female reference. Studies prove that even today we tend to identify women by their first names and men by their first name and last name, title and last name, and so on and so forth. And of course, English is particularly interesting here because married women are still identified by their husband's last name, also after the divorce sometimes. Derogatory names, use of titles, the use of names like full names to refer to public important people or agents versus abstract or generic terms to refer to groups with no power. A few minutes ago, we were talking about marginalized groups or people, and also that marginalization in terms of discourse, of course, takes place naming strategies. I wrote a paper a few years ago, actually, about climate-induced migrants, and the metaphors that were used also sometimes to identify them. And actually, climate-induced migrants were not identified using names. They were just abstract concepts or generic terms or metaphors. So here, instead of the presence of names and what names were used to identify them, what was actually interesting was the absence of names. So the absence of names that is also relevant because, of course, then naming becomes a form of foregrounding in discourse. Whereas in the corpus that I analyzed, other agents, for example, politicians or the directors of agencies and so on and so forth, they were identified, of course, by full title, full name, and so on and so forth. Even more interesting, at least to me, is when names and naming become a form of discourse. So the naming practice itself is a form of discourse. And the study of those naming practices became a sort of critical study of those naming practices, became a sort of critical discourse analysis. There is a branch of onomastics about place names, which is known as critical toponymy, where the study of place names is done through a critical perspective that can be linked to CDA as well, or critical studies in general. And of course, by doing that, by focusing on a critical toponymy perspective, that is particularly relevant or important in situations of imbalanced power relation, like in post-colonial contexts. And here, Marilyn and I have a sort of common background in the past, I worked on some post-colonial naming practices of reappropriation, so naming and renaming in post-colonial contexts. For example, in Canada, in Nunavut, where indigenous place names were made official again after there were, of course, the English or French toponym was imposed, right, for decades. Another example could be a town, a city in Ireland that you maybe are familiar with, that is Queenstown, which is actually now known as Uncov. And that's an interesting story. Here I'm focusing more on the historical background, actually, rather than the linguistic unit. Well, I hope that I'll have time to talk about that in a few minutes. But in the case of Queenstown and Cove, originally that place was called Cove, C-O-V-E, like in English, in 1743. It was known as Cove of Cork, and it was a British naval base. Then it became Queenstown in 1849. Guess why? Why all of a sudden it was named Queenstown. What can be the reason? Yeah.
As a homage
Well,
or something?
yeah. In 1849, Queen Victoria, of course, visited the city, and it was a way to sort of tribute to the Queen. And we know that in the English-speaking world, a lot of place names actually are named after, especially Victoria, I must say. In the 1920s, so of course, Ireland became independent. That town was renamed Cove. And here was a sort of Irish form following independence. It meant, or it looks like authentic because it looks like Gaelic, especially the way it's spelled, but it is actually not a pre-existing Gaelic name. It doesn't exist in Gaelic. It's just a false Gaelicism because it's a homophone of Cove. So the original British name that was actually introduced back in the 18th century. And there is another sort of paradox in the story of Queenstown, Cove, and Cove that is related to the fact that from a tourist point of view, this Victorian heritage is being highly exploited, especially in relation to, the Industrial Revolution, the cultural heritage that is related to that moment in British history. Another example, more or less like this one, and again, we are talking about the reappropriation of indigenous names, is the story of Mount McKinley, Denali, that I had the pleasure actually to present at a conference here in Padua a few years ago. Mount McKinley, it's actually the highest mountain in the United States of America. It's in Alaska. And as Mount McKinley, it was named after the 25th president of the US who served as president from 1896 until his assassination in 1901. And in 1917, again, as a sort of tribute, the mountain was named Mount McKinley within the Mount McKinley National Park. In 2015, President Obama announced the renaming of the mountain to commemorate the Athabasca peoples who, of course, have lived in that part of North America from time immemorial. So whereas Mount McKinley is merely descriptive in terms of, onomastics or in terms of, names, Denali has a completely different discursive meaning and power behind it. Also, the fact that that President Obama chose to rename it using an indigenous word as, let's say, discursive elements in it that are interesting from a critical perspective. I have some, and I would like to, I don't know, is this, can they see this at home?
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, here I have a few case studies, let's say, that I would like to share with you, especially, I don't know, maybe talk about them with you. And I've decided to focus on different types of names. Usually in onomastics, we divide names into 4 categories: personal names, anthroponyms, place names, toponyms, brand names, and literary names. Those are the four major categories. Actually, new ones are introduced. Now we tend to divide e-names, electronic names, because of the relevance, of course, of the digital world. For this presentation today, the examples that I'm using in this case studies one is about place names, another one is about personal names, and then I have one about trade names or brand names. And I also wanted to focus on different types of discourse. And the first one that I have here is about tourism. So tourism discourse, names in tourism discourse, in particular, nicknames sorry.
Presentazione su sinistra.
This one?
No,
da
prima.
Okay, sorry about this.
Dalla seconda? Ok. Adesso vai avanti.
Like this? Okay, can you see it?
Mhm.
Okay, yeah. So I was saying nicknames in tourism discourse, in particular nicknames in tourist guides. So nicknames, very briefly, before focusing on some of the examples here, nicknames are aspects of the process of social action and are used as a form of social labeling. Nicknames are usually employed in informal contexts to strengthen community identity and create in-group solidarity. Examples of odonyms, so street names or place names that have also a nickname, that are names that are used as alternative names to official ones are, I guess, quite popular in Italy. I have some examples from Naples, a city that I know quite well. And here I have 3 people from Naples, so correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking about Piazza Quattro Palazzi, which actually is Piazza Nicola Mora. I'm thinking about Piazza Borsa, which the official name actually is Piazza Bovio, or, Via Toledo, Via Roma, but in that case, it's not really a nickname. It was the official previous name that was replaced. And I'm from Trento, so in Trento we have Piazza Italia, especially when I was a teenager on Saturday afternoon, we all gathered in Piazza Italia. But actually the official name is Piazza Cesare Battisti. So examples of nicknames that are used to identify street names in this case, or place names in general. So what about nicknames in tourism discourse? Nicknames are a form of social construction of space and of destination branding, which influences the tourist gaze as well. And in destination branding, place names and nicknames are turned into brands, which have social and emotional values to tourists, who are, of course, seen as emotional beings. So you work, you play with that to stimulate an emotional reaction. And the use of nicknames privileges subjectivity over objectivity. Through them, tourist destinations become more familiar places where the tourist can become a traveler and travel like a local, so to speak. So this strengthens the idea of a real experience. If I know the nicknames that are used to call that place, then I'm one of them. It's authentic, it's real. And of course, authenticity is a keyword in tourism discourse. And of course, in tourism discourse, informal communication is found, especially online. Thinking about blogs, forums. I'm not, a scholar in discourse, in tourism discourse or tourism studies, but I'm thinking about beautiful articles and books that Sabrina Francesconi, Stefania Maci, Calvi wrote about that. and also about, informal communication in online communication, in online blogs and forums. Some printed tourist guides are characterized by a high level or high degree of informality. And this is especially true when they actually first were published a few years ago now. I'm thinking about Lonely Planet and Rough Guides. I mean, if we compare them to the Guida del Touring, of course, the language employed there is completely different in terms also of informality. And I'm quoting Sabrina Francesconi here, who wrote that, Lonely Planet and Rough Guide series are young, fresh, and alternative texts for real travelers. Again, there is this idea of becoming a real traveler or a local one. According to Jaworski and Turlov, in tourism discourse, language and other semiotic materials are entextualized and recontextualized. So that is taken from a text and replaced into another. So that places are immediately recognized in a familiar way once this process takes place. And why is it so? Because tourism demands a ritualized familiarity or recognizability. Nicknames actually work in a similar way. They are taken from informal communication, people in Naples using Piazza Quattro Palazzi, and recontextualized in a different type of discourse and text, of course, with a specific function, that of reinforcing authenticity through familiarity and informality. Nicknames, moreover, are a form of languaging. That is the way in which, by languaging, I mean, and we have here the former director of the Island Center, so languaging diversity. So by languages, we mean the way in which individuals express their own identity in a specific social and cultural context through language, also in relation with the customary practices of a local culture. So it's always in relation to the cultural context, of course. And in so doing, a linguistic sense of place is acquired by the speaker and also by the tourist. Nicknaming is part of such customary practices, linked to the concept of familiarity I mentioned before. So familiar destination, so you can travel like a local again. And of course, sometimes nicknames are used by the locals, and sometimes they are used by non-local people. So this is true in particular about some places in some cities in North America. Fresno, for example, or Frisco. Nobody in San Francisco actually, or so I was told, uses Frisco as a nickname. It's something that has been used by people from the outside. Yeah. So languaging, moreover, is connected with emotions, memory. And so we go back to what we were saying about the connections between destination branding and emotions as well. Now, the focus of this case study that I would like to share with you is about nicknames used in travel guides, in particular, the Lonely Planet USA, the 10th edition, and the Rough Guide to the USA, 12th edition. I used the Kindle edition. And here you have the covers. Our nicknames in this travel guides used to enhance informality and stimulate an emotional response in the reader, in the tourist. So are they part of a discursive strategy that fosters authenticity? The answer, of course, is yes. But I just wanted to give you some examples. But before that, it's like, about the selection. There are hundreds of nicknames of American states and cities. It looks like an American hobby, more or less. Of course, most of them are never mentioned in the guides, only for the biggest cities, actually. And the examples that I will be giving you in a few moments are from New York and Chicago. But before that, it's a sort of game. So here I have some nicknames. Those refer to American states. So I don't know if you know the actual state here. So the last frontier is up. No, it's up in the north. It's the very last. Alaska. Yeah. The Old Dominion. One of the Florida. No, one of the first colonies. So one of the first Virginia. Yeah, Virginia. We have vacation land for rich people. No, vacation land for rich people from New England, I would say.
From New England,
Maine. Yeah, Maine. Heart of Dixie. Dixieland, Heart of Dixie, music, Alabama.
We know it.
Yeah. Maybe one more.
Show me state.
The show me state is Missouri.
What?
Lone Star State, Texas.
We know that.
Yeah, that's maybe one of the among these
The best.
examples here. I guess that it's the most the one that more or less we identified.
What's the Pelican State?
Pelican State is Louisiana because of the symbol of the state. And here I have some cities. We won't go through all of them, but Athens of the West. What is that? Well, let's say,
There's more than one Athens.
yeah, more than one, but this is of the West. So we are in California, and what is the best, or one of the best universities in California? Berkeley. So Berkeley is called Athens of the West, whereas, and thinking about universities, that's also a sort of clue. Athens of America. Boston, which is also known as Puritan City. Yeah. The Magic City is Miami. Paris of the West. San Francisco, which is also known as City by the Bay, whereas Paris of the South,
Miami.
no, it's New Orleans,
Oh.
which is also known as Queen of Mississippi.
Makes sense.
Okay, there are several examples here. Some of them, of course, I mean, the Magic City, Paris of the West, Athens of the West, and so on and so forth are all positive nicknames. Some of them are not that positive, of course. Philadelphia, to refer to Philadelphia, which is also known as Philly, or thinking about Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh.
Again, so
Inspiring.
yeah, City of Saints is Salt Lake City.
What's Big Tomato?
Big tomatoes.
I
Yeah,
said
sorry.
tomato.
Yeah, it's Sacramento. So Sacramento.
Sorry.
Yeah, because of the yeah.
Sacred tomato.
The mini apple is Minneapolis.
Oh.
Because you have the Big Apple, which
New
is of
York.
course what we all know, New York. And then we have the small apple, which is like Minneapolis. There are
I thought City of Lights, but then you have a City of Saints. What City of Saints?
Salt Lake City. Yeah. But okay, there are several other examples, but
Well, we have
this
no
is not
time
the
for
point.
that.
I'm just giving you a few examples of the way they are used in this tourist guides. What I wanted to say, first of all, is that in the rough guide, New York is used. We have 286 occurrences of the toponym New York, and only 3 occurrences of the toponym or the nickname Big Apple, which means that 1% of the occurrences in which the city that we know as New York is referred to in the tourist guide, 1% of the times is actually called the Big Apple. So it's quite, I'm not saying impressive, but whereas for the Lonely Planet, we have 313 occurrences of the toponym New York and 8 occurrences of the nickname Big Apple. So it's more than double what we have in the rough guides, like almost 2.5%. And so it means that generally speaking, Lonely Planet uses more nicknames than rough guides. And this is true also with other examples. So here you have, I know that I don't have much time. Sorry, maybe I'm a little bit too.
Just
Yeah.
give us a few other
So
examples.
here you have some examples of New York City with world-class museums, restaurants, nightlife and shops aplenty. The Big Apple is in a league of its own. And here the nickname is also used to avoid repetition, I would say, because it's been introduced at the very beginning of this paragraph. Then you have this example here. The Pacific Zone includes the 3 coastal states. This is like the introduction to the destinations to the United States. The Pacific Zone includes the 3 coastal states and Nevada, and it's 3 hours behind New York. 10 a.m. in the Big Apple to 7 a.m. in San Francisco. And I would say that also here, the Big Apple is used, of course, because it's the aim is to build this sort of familiarity and authenticity, I would also say, but also because it's been already used. So it's to avoid repetition as well. Let me see. Okay, from Lonely Planet, here you have the Big Apple has many kid-friendly museums, plus carriage rides and rowboating in Central Park. Or another example here, to the bright lights of the Big Apple, hoping to finally get that big break. Another example that I have here, come to take a bite out of the Big Apple each year. And a couple of examples from the Windy City, so Chicago. Let's see. New Yorkers and Chicagoans can argue for days over which of their respective cities makes the best kind. And we're talking about pizza. Either Gotham's shingle flat slices or the Windy City's overstuffed wedges that actually resemble slices of meat pie. So another example here from Lonely Planet this time. The Windy City will blow you away with its architecture, lakefront beaches, and world-class museums. I mean, the point here is what I was actually saying before. The nicknames in these guides are used and it's very in line with the style, let's say, also of these guides, which are, let's say, more informal, friendly. So the idea is to turn the tourist into a traveler and to have this more authentic experience, even though one of the points that can be made here also from a critical perspective, I guess, is the fact that not necessarily the nicknames are used by local people. So that's the problem. It's one of the issues here, and this is true with tourism discourse in general as well, we can say, is that there is a tendency to homogenize. So like a flattening effect. Okay, Sin City, but yeah. What I wanted to show you also is another case study when names become a sort of discourse, or choosing a name is part of a larger discursive practice. We saw the examples of Queenstown and Denali earlier. The examples that I'm showing here are from another analysis that I carried out a few years ago about green trade names in Canada in particular. Yeah. Let me see what I have here. Yeah, first of all, I want to say a few things about brand names and trade names. Brand names refer to products and other saleable items, whereas trade names designate a firm, a company, or a corporation. And once they are officially registered, brand names are identified by their trademark, while trade names by their legal name. And name registration is mandatory everywhere, I would say, and regulated by dedicated state agencies. In the case of Canada, it's the Department of Industry. Names of Canadian companies that include the lexeme green is the focus of this case study here, of the examples that I would like to share with you. So the question is, does the term green have the semantic property that is usually related, or that refers to the environment-friendly qualities that have been now more and more been recently introduced and now are more and more associated with green in English vocabulary. Definition from the Macmillan Dictionary, green, one of the definitions, of course, one of the meanings, sorry, designed to protect the environment or to limit damage to the environment. That's one of the, of course, meanings of green today. So does a trade name with green in it identify eco-friendly companies? That was another question. And what kind of syntactic and semantic behavior do those names have? How this identification with eco-friendliness is created from a linguistic, structural, syntactic point of view. So are such names truly green trade names? And that's the critical aspect that I was interested in. And to create this, to retrieve my data, so I used the trade names corpus from the online archives of Industry Canada, so the agency that actually is in charge of registering all the names in Canada, and I used the search company listings engine. And with a blank space I had back then, of course, this should be like updated, I guess. But back then I had like more than 50,000 entries, results, which stands for all the names, like all the official trade names that were registered back then in Canada. With the keyword green, I had only, inverted commas, 128 results, which is like 0.25% of the whole corpus. So 0.25% of trade names in Canada have or had actually green in them. And I excluded 11 names because they were actually part neither of their operating or their legal names. So they were retrieved because green was used in other parts of the name description in the database. And 3 more actually were also excluded. So in the end, I ended up with 114 names, out of which 71 used green as an independent word, whereas 43 used green within a compound. And here, and
maybe now
it's time to wrap it up. Yeah. So here you have examples of green as a single term in the attributive position, like the green method, green earth films. There are also other occurrences. Usually it's in adjective noun phrases. You see 58 cases, occurrences. Very limited is the number of names where we have other combinations like noun plus adjectives in the predicative position, or adjective plus adjective phrases, or adverb, or a surname, or a straight name, or green alone, just one case. What about green in compounds? Most of the times, 30 occurrences, green is used as a modifier, not as the head of the compound. And when green is the head, actually, it's usually an existing compound, like a real word. Whereas when green is the modifier, it's like a new compound, like something that has been made up. And we know how creative, names can be. Examples of green as compounds, green as head, or green as modifier. But the interesting part here, and I'm almost concluding here, is when green is a semantic category, so the meaning. Only 64 out of 114 names employed green to refer to nature-related activities, like gardening, agriculture, forestry, or fishery. Or environment-friendly activities, 45 occurrences. How do I know? I actually checked all the, descriptions of the names, and then I also checked the companies to identify them as really eco-friendly or not. So when it comes to environmental friendly companies or names, here we have companies that strive to guarantee sustainable services and organic products to their customers. There are several categories. You see renewable energy, organic food, business consultancy, and so on and so forth. All in all, to conclude, 39.5% of the names in this small corpus can be considered as green trade names, that is, environmental friendly or environment-oriented company names. And this, of course, is also related to the syntactic and semantic evolution of the word, of the lexeme green, and the use of it as discourse. What is interesting is, in terms of, a critical perspective as well, is the fact that here we have several examples of what is known as greenwashing. I just use the word green to create a brand or a trade name that looks like environmental friendly and so on and so forth, but in the end is not. It's just a marketing strategy or an example of greenwashing. So it's, I would say, a discursive practice based on a naming practice, on naming. I had one last example, but I'm not giving it to, I'm not talking about it because I wasn't sure about how interactive my talk should have been. But I don't know, because I didn't want to be like, okay, now let's see this text together and tell me what you think about, because actually it was about names in news discourse, which is what we are probably most familiar with. And I had two articles, old ones, by the way, but because they are too good to be true. I mean, they are taken from the Sun, and I mean, it's like vincere facile, we would say in Italian. But those actually are very old. I mean, this one actually is from the late 80s. It's part of a course book that I usually use in my classes. And I thought that it was, we wouldn't have something like this anymore, I guess. Maybe let's see in a few months in America what happens. I mean, it's still there, but not, I guess, in printed press. It's something that we find now online. So there is like a sort of shift, and it's just. I don't have like consistent elements to prove this, but I wouldn't say that today even the Sun would write something like this. I mean, using this racist slurs to refer to Aboriginal people in Australia, or in the case of this extract here, this article, to describe a woman in a power position, because Kate Colley is the boss of Wayland Prison in Norfolk, so she's the governor of the prison, and my idea was to ask you to analyze together maybe the naming strategies that we have in this text, but I guess that this is not the case. So we are. I'll just finish here, and I would like to thank you for your time, for your attention. I hope that it was kind of.
Thank you.
And thank you very much again for having me.
Sorry for asking you.
Huh?
It's a bit late, but I don't know whether there's any comment. I don't dare. I mean, this is certainly not my field. I was really curious because when you say onomastics, you actually talk toponomastics. So that was something I of course immediately noticed, and one might get to some similar results by, I don't know, using the semiotics of tourism or the semantics of tourism. But of course, it's interesting because you do use some strictly linguistic tools, collecting data. And then, of course, the conclusion is that there is greenwashing. And I would have guessed from the very beginning, but of course, you come with hard proofs or the ways in which consumer culture actually produces in ways which we tend to forget, produces amazing results. I had in mind, I mean, of course, the example you showed us at the very end
Of course, took us back to Australia. I was wondering whether Australia was ever going to be part of your discussion, because many issues having to do with naming are particularly visible in so-called settler societies or post-settler societies. You work on Canada, I work on Australia. So of course, I think that the case of Uluru or Ayers Rock is particularly revealing. Taking or giving names is so fundamental. One can never really forget about it, how important it is to bring it back or to take it back or to reappropriate in ways which, of course, nowadays must also be innovative and creative. One cannot just take an old name, but you have a new branding of that name, even on the part of Aboriginal cultures, I think. But that's my personal take on that. I don't know whether maybe we should, I don't know, shall we go back to Italian, or is there anybody from home who would like to step in, ask a question, or anybody, of course, from here as well? You work on very different things, I know, but I think naming is
the interesting thing, or the good thing about names, is that they are everywhere.
Yeah.
So it can easily, I mean, it's interdisciplinary, it's flexible. I mean, you can have like a sort of perspective on names also in other disciplines, I guess.
But also from a
Yes.
discursive viewpoint, I mean, it's
Yeah.
actually so very important for all of us. You were referring to the examples of Naples, and in particular via Toledo and via Roma.
Sì.
There is a political reason behind
Yeah.
that too, which most of the time people wouldn't know, even the tourists. I mean. But then Mussolini decided that all name streets have to be in Italians and nothing had to refer back to any other country like Toledo or Spain. And that's why he decided it was via Rome also to, somehow refer to the power
And to
of
cancel
the
prior empires and prior history.
from Italy. But then, of course, Neapolitans resisted that ban, and still today they keep on calling that street, to the point that from an administrative point, my bank, I mean the bank where I got my bank account basically, is in via Toledo 234, which is also via Roma 122.
They have the same.
It's also quite confusing, but then it tells a lot about the way people would use name also to represent themselves. So it's an act of identity all the time. They're used differently by, different types of communities. So absolutely. What is actually quite interesting also, because that's more into your type of research, has got to do with the way First Nations, who still use names which were somehow given to them by the colonizers, but at the same time they decided to keep on using as a sort of a personal identity take onto the people conquering them. And there's a lot of examples which then also expand onto the United States of America.
Yeah, and quite a lot of examples of dual names.
Yes.
Exactly,
There-
where especially you got like two names to represent one single thing.
In your part of the country, of course, you know something
Yeah,
about
in Anzoardi.
double, if not triple naming. at
Yeah,
times,
in
but
some
also
parts of it
triple.
also 3 names, because there is also Ladino. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting. And also I was thinking about Canada and Nunavut. Sometimes the English name is kept, however, because then it's internationally recognized. Otherwise, for, I don't know, flights, for example, it could be, now I can't remember the name of the one city where there is an airport in Nunavut, which is still in English, even though the dual name, of course, sometimes it's an official, because then the thing is, especially with, dual names, are they officially both? Are they official dual names, or only one actually is official and the other is used by the local population, or it's used like as sort of in-group strategy to mark identity as well?
Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
thing.
Especially for that reason, I guess,
Yeah.
because that's a way of not stressing somebody's own viewpoint. I think you got like a question on.
Yeah, there's somebody, Laura Santini, who wrote something down in the
How
chat.
do you
Can
get to?
You want to speak up, or do you just want to?
In basso vedi chat.
No, I can do that.
Thanks a lot for your presentation.
I've been working on Douglas Coupland's novels. Okay, exactly.
Hi, hello. It's me.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very, very interesting, very inspiring.
Thank you.
I I did a little bit of this, not as consistently, but as I was discussing some metaphors within Douglas Coupland novels, and is very often doing precisely what you mentioned, so conveying hidden ideological assumption via using proper names as pre-modifier and derogatory in a derogatory sort of to convey a derogatory meaning. So it is very fascinating that there is a full. So thank you for actually opening up to me the idea that there is actually a very specific brand of critical discourse analysis. So that encourages me to do some more work on that, because it is really interesting the way it does rely a lot on compounding, and the way compounding in English can become, endless, and also very, paranomasia is also part of it. But on the other side, there is so much socioeconomic impact that you can have on a narrative via such a technique, a lexical technique. So thank you very much. Really, I really appreciated what you presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I was also thinking that, of course, there are some literary genres in which naming is fundamental, like, children's literature. We were talking about, I don't know, Dumbledore, one of them, right? Or other genres like science fiction, where worlds are created through names. Yeah, and those have also a discursive power in them, I think, in terms of gender, ethnicity, because like new gender identities are created also through names, for example. So yeah, I really like onomastics, because it's like there are so many possibilities in it. I know that especially in Italy, I would say that it's part of Italian linguistics. I would say that there are some scholars in Italian linguistics that focus on names, especially from an etymological point of view. What I'm more interested in is, as you have noticed, I guess, is again, the discursive power of names and naming practices.
The hierarchy of God.
Yeah, that sometimes can be easily applied to a, let's say, traditional critical discourse analysis, which just focus on the names, the same way you focus on, I don't know, noun phrases or verb phrases and so on and so forth. But also, naming is discourse somehow.
It's also interesting to think, to go back to your cities and the ways in which they are veiled or masked behind names, and the ways in which they are somehow marketed via those nicknames. And this also made me think about strange idea that we have of communities, of cities, so that they are indeed imagined. And it is, once again, a matter of power. Who is deciding what can be sold and what is saleable? You did use the word saleable, so I found it very interesting. And I was wondering whether frisco is a derogatory term. Would it be? Or they would never use it, but is it because it sounds somehow derogatory, or
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. I should look it up. I don't know.
And of course, this dream of catching or construing ideas of authenticity, this is something you can find really in every not only discourse area, but also, of course, in literature, everywhere. It's essential to somehow try and disentangle our research activities from this continuous obsession with, capturing authenticity, capturing the origin.
And it's really about also what I was saying earlier about languaging. So how you project your identity through these strategies, because my story, when, first time I seriously went to Naples was, I don't know, 2008 maybe? Like not as a tourist, like being there and living there somehow. So getting to know that the city from like a local, so to speak.
You can never be a local.
That's the thing, right? But I was so proud when I found out that, Piazza Quattro Palazzi. So if you use that, you feel more connected to the city.
I am a local.
So
and I
it's a
don't
way
feel
to construct also your social and linguistic identity. using those, yeah. So it's true that, yeah.
That's true.
People looking for Piazza Salvo d'Acquisto and nobody would know. It's
Nobody
actually
knows.
like Piazza Carità, which is
I would
Yeah.
never know
Yes.
myself.
and there are many places which actually led to.
I'm
the
pretty sure that there
modern
must be like a sort of,
In every city.
I don't know,
I'm sure.
index of all this
Yeah.
places in Italy or elsewhere, not just, yeah.
Mm.
I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. It was fascinating, very generous. Thank you. And also, I mean, it's an old but unknown field to me, but resonates with, I mean, everyone's life. So I was thinking, for example, I enjoyed the remark on the many aromas that we find in Italy. And I was wondering if there's an overlap from a perspective of critical discourse analysis with the so many little Venices that we have all around the world. I mean, that there are different reasons for this, but there's a flattening factor to nicknaming.
Yeah,
There's this flattening factor to nicknaming.
yeah,
And I was wondering if there's an overlap, of course, with the Jew differences.
there could be, of course,
There's two
and
processes
yeah.
of naming 100 aromas and thousands of little Venices. And it's funny because I remember that visiting Bologna so many years ago, people from Bologna were helping us around the city, took us there as a matter of pride in some way. So there was no shame in showing us their little Venice. I mean, it's so many facets to what can happen.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about North America and the many little Italies that we have, the many Chinatowns that we have, and in that case, those names are reduplicated. I mean, it's always Little Italy,
Cloned, really.
or it's always Chinatown. It's Chinatown in New York, Chinatown there, Chinatown here. So there is, yeah, a name basically, to identify, in this case, what used to be called ethnic districts or ethnic neighborhoods in cities. We don't like that label anymore, of course. Also in London, think about London.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about the implication for my field, which is from the implications of in an early modern piece of drama, staging the proper name, the given names of streets which were all unknown to people not from London, for example, which I suppose it would cause pride satisfaction from the audience, which is a rare thing to do for a playwright of the time. But it does happen and it has consequences.
There is this American scholar, Smith is the last name, I can't remember now the name, who actually, specializes in names in Shakespeare. So if you're interested in that, he wrote several books on names in Shakespeare's plays, and Elena mentioned the fact that I served as a member at large of the American Name Society, and at those conferences were really interdisciplinary because there were like scholars in linguistics, scholars in literary studies, and he presented quite a lot of papers on names in, I don't know,
Drama, literature, whatever.
King Lear, and but Shakespeare is.
In Dickens, I would imagine immediately, but that's I suppose I really have to stop this because we're somehow really running late. Thank you so much again.